All right. So, hello everybody. So let's. Good morning, good afternoon, good night. I don't know where you are. So, very welcome to today's presentation. So I'm going to present myself very quickly and then introduce Professor John Esling. Okay. So I am Alexandro Meirelles. I am bachelor in music at the Federal University of Espírito Santo and also in English studies at the Federal University of Minas Gerais. I have a PhD in linguistics at Unicamp, and I was a visiting professor at the University of Southern California in 2014-2015, and am currently a guest scientist at Hochschule für Technik, Berlin. Since 2008, I am a professor at UFES, full professor, teaching phonetics in undergraduate courses and graduated courses in linguistics, where I am the director of a phonetics laboratory. So among my experimental specialties of research in singing and speech, I highlight EMA, EPG, EGG, oral and nasal pressure, ultrasound, and acoustic analysis. I am currently working on the development of a protocol for analyzing voice quality in speech and singing. So today the presentation is from the Brazilian Linguistic Association that is in cooperation with several other associations, the Comitê Internacional Permanente de Linguistas, a FAO, Associação de Linguística e Filologia da América Latina, Sociedade Argentina de Estudos Linguísticos, Associação de Linguística Aplicada do Brasil, Associação Internacional de Linguistique Appliquée, Linguistic Society of America, Linguística Sociopáca, Australia Linguistic and Sociedade Espanhola de Linguísticas. So all of the association bring us linguists online. The event is designed to give students and researchers free access to state-of-the-art discussions on the most diverse topics related to the study of human language. Today, we are going to see the larynx as an articulator, not just a glottis. We need a new vocal tract. So I am very proud in order to introduce you, John Esling. So John Esling is Professor Emeritus of Linguistics at the University of Victoria, former Secretary of the International Phonetic Association, 1995-2003, member of the IPA Council and of the Permanent Council for the Organization of the International Congress of Phonetic Science, former editor of the Journal of the President of the International Phonetic Association, 2011-2015. He has a master in linguistics from the University of Michigan, 1972, where he studied with Ian Catford and Kenneth Pike, and the PhD in phonetics from the University of Edinburgh, where he worked with David Abercrombie, John Laver, and James Anthony. He taught at the University of Leeds before moving to the University of Victoria in British Columbia, Canada in 1981. He was chair of the Department of Linguistics from 2008 to 2013. His research is in auditory and articulatory phonetics, particularly the characterization of voice quality, of voice register, and of the phonetic production and modeling of laryngeal and pharyngeal sounds. So, summing up a little bit. Recently, he developed with Professor Scott Moisek, Alison Benner, and Lizzie Crevier-Burman the Laryngeal Articulator Model, published in the book Voice Quality, the Laryngeal Articulator Model. According to Esling and his colleagues, 2019, the lower part of the vocal tract contains a complex articulator equivalent to the tongue in the oral vocal tract. So I'm very honored to pass the word to Professor John Esling.
Thank you, Alexandro, and thank you, Abralin, for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here and to talk about what we've found in the vocal tract. I think what we're able to tell you is that we have two articulators in the vocal tract, the tongue and the laryngeal articulator. And I'm going to explain today how those two articulators work together and for you to be able to recognize what they do. Can you see the PowerPoint?
Not yet.
Not yet, yeah. Have you shared the screen? Yeah, now we got it.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues, Scott Moisick and Alison Benner from the University of Victoria, where we worked on this model, Lise Crévier-Buchmann in Paris, and Philippe Arimi and a number of other people who have contributed, especially the material from different languages around the world. What I'd like to begin with is the traditional vocal tract model, which is basically a model of the tongue. And here you see the tongue. The tongue is the active articulator. These are the passive articulators. And there's nothing much in the pharynx in this model. There's no articulator to speak of in the pharynx. The only part of the larynx that we see is the glottis, which is for voicing or voicelessness. It's either closed or open. But there's nothing in the tube of the vocal tract until we get up to the upper vocal tract. Today, I'm going to explain what's in the lower vocal tract and what we should pay attention to. This is the model of the vocal tract that we've developed, where the vocal folds are the glottis, but this is only the bottom of the epilaryngeal tube, which is this part of the vocal tract here. It's a small chamber with the vocal folds at the bottom and the aryepiglottic folds at the top. They run from the arytenoid cartilages up to the borders of the epiglottis, behind the hyoid bone. We've divided the vocal tract into two parts. This line is the division between the oral vocal tract, which you're very familiar with, and the laryngeal vocal tract, which I'm going to explain today. There's a connection between the laryngeal vocal tract and the tongue in that the tongue moves in three basic directions: to the front, upwards and backwards, which we call raising, downwards and backwards, which we call retracting, and it's the retraction that connects with the laryngeal articulator. We can call this whole mechanism the aryepiglottic laryngeal constrictor mechanism or laryngeal articulator mechanism. This mechanism engages first when we constrict in the larynx. After that, the tongue retracts. And there's a second thing that goes along with these two, with aryepiglottic constriction, tongue retraction, and that other thing is larynx height. Generally, the larynx raises at the same time that we constrict in the larynx. Now, I'm going to show you how constriction works, but these three things will always be potential components of constriction. The first one is constriction of the epilaryngeal tube. The second is lingual retraction. And the third is larynx raising, although larynx raising is much more optional than the others. There are two other things that are very interesting that go along with laryngeal constriction. And that is, here you see that the nasal passage is closed. But very often the nasal passage opens when there's laryngeal constriction. Also, when there's constriction in the larynx, the jaw tends to open. So we'll see that in phonologies of world languages, We often have laryngeal constriction together with open vowels, and those vowels can often be nasalized. So the opening of the jaw, nasalization, and laryngeal constriction are also potential parts of how the larynx works. Now I can show you another more anatomically correct version of the vocal tract that was designed by Scott Moysick. And this shows you the oral articulator in detail with the tongue moving in 3 directions. And then below the retraction of the tongue, we have the laryngeal vocal tract. And the larynx has always been described as true vocal folds between the thyroid cartilage and the arytenoid cartilages, which are on top of the cricoid cartilage. And then above the true vocal folds are the false or ventricular vocal folds. This is the ventricle here. These are the ventricular folds. And then this space is the epilaryngeal tube. At the top of the epilaryngeal tube are the aryepiglottic folds because they run from the arytenoids to the borders of the epiglottis. We'll show you that in a photograph in a minute. In the middle of the aryepiglottic folds are the cuneiform cartilages. These tubercles are shaped like little cuneiform wedges, and they hold the aryepiglottic folds up. We can think of the epilaryngeal tube as a tube within a tube. That means that the first point of articulation in the vocal tract is the epilaryngeal tube. As I said, it's the vocal folds which begin the tube and the aryepiglottic folds which end the tube. And then the pharyngeal tube begins. In the traditional model we looked at, it's generally the tongue which is thought to close against the back wall of the pharynx to produce pharyngeals. This is not the way we view pharyngeals. So any sounds that are called pharyngeals or epiglottals or laryngally constricted sounds are made not primarily with the tongue closing off the pharyngeal area, but primarily, number one, with the epilaryngeal tube narrowing and even closing. As a concomitant to that, the tongue retracts and then the tongue moves back into the pharynx. There is a third valve or sphincter in the vocal tract, which is in the oral vocal tract. It's called the oropharyngeal isthmus or the velic sphincter. This is a view of how the laryngeal articulator works. On the left, we see the laryngeal articulator open, as in breathing, so that we're not producing any sounds except a very light H, perhaps. In the middle, we have the laryngeal constrictor about halfway constricted. So you can see that the aryepiglottic folds are shortened. The epilaryngeal tube is about half as big as it was before, and the larynx is slightly raised. On the right, we see that the aryepiglottic folds are much shorter. The constrictor is almost closed, so the epilaryngeal tube is almost as small as it can be before it shuts completely. And the larynx is much more compacted. We can quantify these differences first with laryngoscopy, which is a visual view from above. And then we can use cineradiography to quantify the vertical movement of the larynx, and also laryngeal ultrasound. If you look at the chart of the vowels from the IPA chart, you can see that the division into vowels follows our model, where these vowels at the front are called fronted, and the difference between close and open vowels is the position of the jaw. The jaw is either close or open. And we use that terminology from the IPA to refer to jaw closeness or openness, as opposed to talking about the tongue being high or the tongue being low. In the same way, instead of saying that the tongue is front or back, we call the upwards and raised position of the tongue raised, and we call the lower or backed position of the tongue retracted. So these vowels are inherently retracted. These are the raised vowels, and these are the fronted vowels, and these are fronted vowels with jaw opening. In this way, we're able to better predict what the effect of the laryngeal articulator is going to be on vowel quality. Now, if we look at a laryngoscopic picture of the larynx, we can see down into the throat of the subject. We're looking straight into the mouth, down over the tongue, and here you can see where the tongue is. You can see the uvula in the picture. We're looking over the epiglottis and down into the epilaryngeal tube. We can see the glottis, the opening between the vocal folds, and we can see the ventricular folds just above and forward of the vocal folds. And then at the back, we can see the aryepiglottic folds. The aryepiglottic folds begin at the arytenoids here and move up through the cuneiform tubercles or cartilages, which are these dots, and then up to the borders of the epiglottis. So this ring at the top forms the upper border of the epilaryngeal tube. This is the tube that constricts to produce pharyngeal consonants, epiglottal consonants, and laryngally constricted sounds, adding, for example, pharyngeal coloring or pharyngeal voice quality to the sound of a voice. Another picture shows us the epiglottis. We're a little bit closer to the larynx. We can see the vocal folds, the ventricular folds at the sides and to the front. At the back, the arytenoids. In the middle of the aryepiglottic folds, we see the cuneiform cartilage here and here. And at the top, the ring around the upper border defines the top of the epilaryngeal tube. Now we can look at a subject producing two kinds of voice. In this picture, we see the vocal folds, which are generally white. The ventricular folds are more pink. Here's the trachea and the airway coming up from the lungs. This is the tubercle of the epiglottis. The aryepiglottic folds are going to bend at the cuneiform tubercles and come up to the tubercle of the epiglottis, where they can shut completely and close off the airway. The aryepiglottic folds at both sides join the borders of the epiglottis about halfway or 2/3 of the way up the epiglottis. But remember, the epiglottis is a passive articulator, and that's why we call some sounds epiglottal sounds, because the aryepiglottic mechanism is the active articulator, and it moves up towards the front, so that this is the active articulation which begins with normal abduction for voicing. In this case, the voicing is breathy voiced. So we can listen to it. And we use laughter, because laughter is a sequence of voiceless voicing, voiceless voicing. So it's an H followed by an ah, ha, ha. So we can see the glottis in a voiceless state and in a voiced state. In the case of breathy voice, it's both at the same time. Voicing happens between the vocal folds at the front. You see them vibrating here. And voicelessness occurs through the gap at the posterior end of the glottis between the arytenoids. So that gives us voicing and breathiness at the same time. Now, whispery voice is different from that because it has more friction. How does the greater friction arise? It arises between the narrowed channel of the epilaryngeal tube. The tube will be more constricted. So here we have a fairly open tube for breathy voice, but on the right, you see that the epilaryngeal tube is extremely constricted. Because of the narrowed tube, the narrow passage, there's more turbulent air coming through the passage. It generates more friction, and that's what we hear as noise. So let's listen to whispery voice. And it could be a little harsh as well, because these structures, when they're very close to each other, tend to vibrate. So when we produce breathy voice, there's less chance of those structures vibrating. When the structures from the back of the larynx come up closer to the tubercle of the epiglottis at the front, there's more chance for all of these mucosal structures to vibrate in the airstream. So that produces a little bit of harshness in the vibratory signal, in the acoustic wave. The noise is created by the fact that the glottis is open at the back, just like breathy voice. In fact, you could say that whispery voice is just a combination of voicing at the vocal folds and breath through the posterior gap in the glottis, just like breathy voice, except that the aryepiglottic mechanism is more constricted in whispery voice. That means the epilaryngeal tube is tighter in whispery voice and produces more turbulence, therefore more noise in the signal. Also, the possibility for these structures around the tube to vibrate, which means that harsh whispery voice is very likely to occur. Now we can look at some other non-modal types of voice, which are a product of constriction of the epilaryngeal tube. In other words, constriction of the laryngeal articulator. So instead of the larynx just being a producer of voicing at the glottis, we are looking at the larynx as a laryngeal articulator, equivalent to the tongue in the oral vocal tract. Now, creaky voice, as you know, is low-pitched phonation. And you can see that there's not much of the glottis visible when we're producing creaky voice. We have opening during a laughter sequence, ha, and then voicing, but you see that the voicing is very limited. In other words, the vocal folds are very short. Well, the mechanism for shortening the vocal folds is the same constriction of the laryngeal articulator as the mechanism for producing constricted phonation types, such as creaky voice or harsh voice. You can see that the aryepiglottic folds are bent at almost a right angle, so that the cuneiform cartilages are pushed up against the epiglottis, and here, the base of the epiglottis. So there's only a very narrow channel for the voice or the waveform, the acoustic signal, to pass through the tube. In harsh voice, we have even more constriction. So you can see it's very similar to creaky voice, but these structures are going to be more vertically compacted. In other words, the distance from bottom to top is shorter and the phonation is much more perturbed. The phonation is much more interrupted. It becomes irregular in harsh voice. So we have not only the vocal fold effect, but also the effect of all of these structures being pressed together in the vertical plane. That gives us the aperiodicity, or the irregularity of harsh voice. Now, we can also, at usually low pitch, trill the aryepiglottic folds. We can get them to vibrate in a regular pattern. Now, there are two aryepiglottic folds. They don't vibrate together as the vocal folds do. So when the vocal folds come together, or the ventricular folds, they vibrate against each other. But the aryepiglottic folds vibrate independently. You can see them at the sides. Also between, this is voiceless and then voiced. And you can see that the vocal folds will be vibrating here, as well as these mucosal parts of the upper border of the epilaryngeal tube. So that movement here, and also the movement at the side, where each aryepiglottic fold goes up to the epiglottis, those contribute to the waveform that we're hearing. So it's these vibrations that add different frequencies to the signal, not just the glottal vibration. So when we talk about constricted phonation types or non-modal phonation types, most of them are, most non-modal phonation types are constricted, the exception being breathy voice, which also tends to occur at low pitch, but it's a very open form of phonation. And also falsetto, of course, is not constricted. It's a high-pitched mode of modal voice. Now, if we constrict the larynx and also use high pitch, we get what we call laryngeal constriction with high pitch, which is also called pressed voice. And the reason for that is because high pitch is generated by stretching the vocal folds with the cricothyroid muscles at the front to make the vocal folds longer. And making the vocal folds longer produces a higher pitched vibration at the glottis between the vocal folds. But at the same time, if we constrict in the larynx and engage the laryngeal constrictor, which moves forwards and is attempting to shorten the vocal folds, we get an isometric tension between the lengthening mechanism and the shortening mechanism. This creates a tightness, which you can hear in this pressed voice. So you can see here that the larynx is stretched, and if we didn't have constriction, this would be falsetto voice, high pitch. But instead, we're tightening down so that the epilaryngeal tube is narrowed at the same time that we've stretched the vocal folds, creating this isometric tension, which would be the kind of voice that you get when you lift on the table, you press up on the table, and it's a straining kind of voice. In other words, what we're doing is we're holding the air in the lungs so that we can use our arms to lift something, and only letting the air out gradually. In something like aryepiglottic trilling, we're letting a lot of air out in a rapid, fast time. But you can see that this is a voiced pharyngeal trill, because the laryngeal articulator is how we produce pharyngals and epiglottals. And the trilling is because part of that aryepiglottic mechanism is adding to the vibration from the glottis. Now, we've used laryngoscopy to look at a number of languages. And you can come back and look at this presentation to go online and study some of the phonological descriptions of these languages to see what they do in the larynx and to see why we wanted to investigate them. Many of them have pharyngeal consonants, like Semitic languages. Many of them, or languages from the west coast of Canada, like Wakashan and Salish languages. Other languages, like Tibeto-Burman languages, or West African languages, or East African languages, have laryngeal constriction as part of a phonological series. When we conduct fibro-optic laryngoscopic research in a soundproof booth, we use the laryngoscope developed by Sawashima and his colleagues in Japan. And here we have an example of what we can see in the production of a Buddhist monk who has learned how to become a chant master. So we're looking through the nose into the vocal tract, just above the larynx, where we can see the epiglottis, the vocal folds, the ventricular folds on either side, the aryepiglottic folds, and we're going to see how this chant master produces his deep chant by forming all of these levels of valves into one ring, a narrow ring, to produce a very unique combined massed vibration. Now, this takes a long time to learn, and it's what I would call a professional use of the voice. Singers, chanters, people who use their voice professionally have very good control of the voice, and we don't usually see this much effect being exercised in the languages of the world as part of a phonology. This is what we would call practiced, professional, and quite exquisite. Now, if we look at a speaker of a Semitic language, Tigrinya from Ethiopia, we can see that it has a glottal stop in the phonology, which Jan Goffin in Stockholm at KTH used to call reduced protective closure. And this is because it only closes the laryngeal tube part way. So let's listen to the glottal stop. E, 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 E. So you can see that the glottal stop only closes that much. It's enough to compress. The question here is, how is a glottal stop produced? And the answer is that there is enough compression in the very slight constriction of the laryngeal mechanism to press the vocal folds together and downwards onto the vocal folds to stop them from vibrating. So there's enough vertical compression in this system to stop the vocal fold vibration and produce a glottal stop, momentary stopping of the voicing. If we move on, you see that the laryngeal tube opens. And if we go back, it closes just enough to produce that glottal stop. That's a picture of a glottal stop. Now, Tigrinya also has an epiglottal stop in its inventory, or we could call that a pharyngeal stop. They're the same thing. Or an aryepiglotto-epiglottal stop, because the aryepiglottic folds are the active articulator articulating against the tubercle of the epiglottis. And you will see that that amounts to full protective closure. E, 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 E. And we can see that the mechanism closes as it moves upwards against the base of the epiglottis. So the epiglottis is not the active articulator. The tongue is moving back, but the tongue is moving back and retracting only because the laryngeal constrictor mechanism has moved upwards and forwards first. Here's the complete closure. And then it releases quite quickly. And we note that from an evolutionary perspective, that rapid opening of the larynx is probably what contributed to how humans use the larynx the way it evolved. Or the way it evolved is the reason why we use the larynx that we do, the way we do. So again, you can look at the complete closure of the airway. E, 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 E. Arabic also has pharyngeals. And Iraqi Arabic has a full epiglottal stop or pharyngeal stop when the voiced pharyngeal is a geminate in the middle of a word, as in this word.
سعيد سعيد.
And you can see that the same closure, full closure of the laryngeal mechanism is occurring in the middle of the word. You can hear it.
سعيد 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 سعيد.
Okay, we can do this sound. In fact, we make this sound every time we swallow. If you swallow and then stop in the middle and then produce a sound, you're producing an epiglottal stop. And I can let you in on a secret that I'm not going to talk about in this talk, but this is in fact the first consonantal sound that we produce when we're babies. So within our first weeks of life, we produce an epiglottal stop because epiglottal stop is the full protective closure of the airway. And as infants, we have to do that in order to learn how to combine breathing with eating and with eventually speaking. So epiglottal stop is a significant landmark on the phonetic chart. Sometimes in Iraqi Arabic, the aryepiglottic folds trill against the epiglottis in the way that we just saw. At the beginning of this word, you can hear the trilling.
عنا عنا.
It's that beginning part, that part. And here you can see the right vocal fold. We're looking right into the subject's mouth. So this is the subject's right. We're looking at that vocal fold vibrating quite a bit. The other one isn't, but we'll look at that in a minute. In other languages, such as Caucasian languages like Agul, there is also a trill, which may be the realization of different phonetic sounds in the phonological sounds. But phonetically, it's trilling. And also in the middle of the word. Hi. That may be the contextual element that triggers the trilling. That phoneme may have other realizations when it's initial or final in the word. And another speaker. So the in the middle of the word is aryepiglottic trilling. In Iraqi Arabic, the medial voiceless pharyngeal, when it's geminated, when it's doubled, can also produce voiceless aryepiglottic trilling.
رحيل رحيل.
So you can see the movement here. The epilaryngeal tube is closing, narrowing, and the aryepiglottic folds are vibrating. Also, you see the larynx is raising. We'd like to be able to measure that.
رحيل.
Here's another word with a medial voiceless geminate pharyngeal.
سحر سحر سحر.
And you can see it's mainly this right aryepiglottic fold which is undulating in the airstream. But we make this sound all the time in every language. If you clear your throat, when it's voiceless a voiceless aryepiglottic trill. When it's voiced a voiced aryepiglottic trill. And we alternate between the two, just like in laughter. So clearing the throat is an alternation between a voiceless and a voiced aryepiglottic trill.
سحر.
Now, using high-speed laryngoscopy, we can look at the vibration in slow motion. And here we have an example which doesn't have any sound because it's moving so slowly, but we've recorded at 500 hertz, 500 cycles per second, and slowed it down to look at just a couple of seconds of trilling. You can see that on the right, it's vibrating more widely, and on the left, it's vibrating, on the left of the speaker, it's vibrating more narrowly. So the aryepiglottic folds are actually vibrating in two different modes. And the initial vibration is, of course, coming from the vocal folds at the glottis. Now, we can take a picture from the laryngoscopic image and measure those two sides of the laryngeal articulator. And using a program in MATLAB developed by Scott Moisick, we can analyze the right and the left apertures or openings independently by calculating the difference between the pixels when they are white and the pixels when they are dark. When they're white, it's open, and when they close down, it's dark, or we can switch that around. So the area of white, the aperture, is calculated for every frame. Here, we can see that the right side, which is in green, and the left side, which is in red, are vibrating at different frequencies. The red is more or less vibrating at the same frequency as the glottis. So if we're vibrating at about 100 hertz or 110, then this side of the aryepiglottic folds is also vibrating at about 100 or 110 hertz. Whereas on the left side, the right side, sorry, the aryepiglottic folds are vibrating at half that frequency. So about 50 hertz. And we can see that in the green trace. That part of the aryepiglottic fold is only vibrating on every other glottal vibration. And you can see that in the spectrum as well. You can see it at about 2,500 to 3,000 hertz. Now, another way that languages can use the vocal tracts is to have a series in the phonology which contrasts an open articulator in the larynx with a closed or a narrowed articulator. So an open epilarynx in a language like Nosuyi has a lax series and a tense series. The lax series, this word sounds like this.
Ps, ps,
And the opening is about this much. And it contrasts with another word, which is laryngally constricted.
ps, ps,
And you can see that the constriction is much greater. There's very little space between the aryepiglottic mechanism and the epiglottis. So again, the two words are
ps, ps, ps,
the difference between and in another minimal pair, the open epilarynx gives us the first word,
pu, pu,
and the second word is,
pro, pro,
which is much more narrow. And you can hear at the same time that the larynx is narrowed that the lips are also trilling, which is a very interesting accompaniment.
pro, pro,
But the reason you hear the sound differently is because the laryngeal area has reduced in volume, and also because the larynx is raised. You can see in the brightness of the light that the larynx is higher here than in this word. We'd like to be able to measure that. So we're going to look at some other instrumental techniques that allow us to measure how high the larynx is and how narrow the volumes, the lower vocal tract, are. In another language, MP, analyzed by Jimmy G. Harris, there is also a lax series and a tense series. You can hear the difference, so we can attune ourselves to the difference in quality to be able to recognize when a language has a constricted form. So this is open,
C,
narrowed,
C,
open,
C,
constricted,
C,
open,
C,
constricted,
C,
open,
C,
constricted,
C,
open,
C,
constricted,
C,
open,
C,
narrowed.
C.
And you can hear that the constricted quality is quite evident at low pitch.
C.
Because as we said, the mechanism for lowering pitch and the mechanism for constricting to generate harsh voice or aryepiglottic trilling is the same mechanism. In West African languages like Akan, there's also a series which has been called ATR, advanced tongue root, as opposed to minus ATR, or retracted tongue root. But they are, in fact, the same difference that we just saw in Tibeto-Burman languages between an open epilaryngeal tube and a narrowed tube. This is the open one.
Tu. Tu.
It's a syllable at high pitch with high tone, but it's open, as opposed to the same syllable at high tone, but laryngally constricted.
To. To.
You can see the difference in the shape of the articulator in the middle of the word. This is open and lowered. This is constricted and raised. Kabylie, which is a language of Togo, analyzed by Cécile Padayoudi, has a high-pitched syllable, which has an open constrictor mechanism, which contrasts with the same high-pitched sequence with a constricted mechanism. And in her description, she used the retracting diacritic, but we could also use the raising diacritic to indicate that there's an accompaniment to the vowel quality which is originating in the larynx. Here's the difference in quality.
Tu. Tu. To. To.
So the change in the laryngeal volume affects the spectrum and the acoustic and auditory quality of the waveform. And it also changes the vowel quality. So we can double mark the two parts of this minimal pair. The first word in the minimal pair has no marking, and the second one is both a retracted vowel and a constricted larynx. They go together. They're representing the same thing, but they're different because primarily of laryngeal constriction. In Somali, there's also a contrast between an open series and a constricted series.
Fuse.
Deed. Deed.
Okay.
As opposed to,
Deed. Deed.
so this is a minimal pair where this word is open and lowered, and this word is, see the raising, raised and constricted. So, Now we've also used cineradiography to look at laryngeals to be able to look at this vertical component of how much the larynx is raising during laryngeal constriction. So we did work at the Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro and worked with Leonardo Fox and Milton Costa to do some cineradiography from the side of the throat. So we're looking at a sagittal section from the side, and we can construct different regions of interest using a MATLAB program that Scott Moisick developed. And this is an arbitrary region which defines the epilaryngeal tube. It doesn't matter how big it is. We're just looking at the difference in luminosity between light pixels and dark pixels. That's going to tell us what the aperture size is. Above that, we have a pharyngeal region of interest, and we can do the same thing there. We can see how it's contracting or expanding. There are also some other measurements we can make. This is the epilaryngeal tube at the bottom of the pharyngeal tube, and we can measure its angle. We can measure the distance between the vocal folds and the aryepiglottic folds. And we can measure two distances of larynx height, arbitrary distances from an arbitrary point, which tell us about the change in height of the larynx. This is an example of our aryepiglottic epiglottal stop. In the middle, you can see here where the aryepiglottic folds come up and bend, and then both press up against the tubercle of the epiglottis. This is the tongue. This is the top of the epiglottis, behind the hyoid bone. But down here, or here's the epiglottis, but it's down here, way below the top of the epiglottis where the stricture takes place, between the epilaryngeal tube and the rest of the pharyngeal tube. So here, we open for a breath, and then, and here's where the closure takes place. You can see that the epilaryngeal tube has practically disappeared, but we need to measure that. So let's look at the area of the pharyngeal tube. We see the pharyngeal tube is fairly open most of the time, whereas the epilaryngeal tube basically goes to zero area. And we can assume from that that it's probably zero volume in the epilaryngeal tube. But that's an extrapolation. We have to use other techniques to begin to look at volume. The distance, larynx height doesn't change, but the separation between the aryepiglottic folds and the vocal folds is zero. They've come together. And the angle of the epilaryngeal tube is also zero. So we can assume it's completely shut. This is the voiceless aryepiglottic trill. And you can see that there's some narrowing in the pharyngeal tube, and there's some narrowing in the epilaryngeal tube, but you can see the trilling happening here between the active and the passive articulator. And you can't see everything because this is a mid-sagittal section, which means that the aryepiglottic folds, because they're coming up at both sides, we're not seeing every slice through the throat. We'd have to use another technique to do that. Here we can see that the area of the pharyngeal tube is not very tight, but the area of the epilaryngeal tube is very tight. And the distance is shortened, the angle has reduced. In the voiced aryepiglottic trill, we can see that the voicing, the secondary voicing, the primary voicing is coming from here. The secondary voicing is happening up here. And when we measure, we see that the area has reduced in the epilaryngeal tube more than in the pharyngeal tube. The area has almost gone to zero, but of course it's still open for the continuant sound at the top of the epilaryngeal tube, and the angle has shut down to about to a small portion of its normal size. Now we can also use simultaneous laryngoscopy and laryngeal ultrasound to compare the picture from the laryngoscope and the vertical dimensions that Scott Moysick is testing here on the subject. This is the laryngeal cross-section, and it corresponds to the vocal folds here in the ultrasound image, the ventricular folds here above the ventricle, and the aryepiglottic folds up here, which are usually missing in the traditional model. In fact, in anatomical sections, the aryepiglottic folds are usually ignored. But an anatomist like Milton Costa will tell you that this is an essential part of the mechanism of the larynx. And we're very grateful to him for helping us illustrate that. So we can find these parts of the laryngeal mechanism in the ultrasound. These demonstrations, by the way, are available in the IPA Phonetics app so that you can see how pharyngeal epiglottal sounds are produced, not only with laryngoscopy, but you can see with ultrasound what the vertical component looks like. And Scott Moysick used an optic flow analysis to measure the movement, just like measuring movement in any video. It's a collection of a velocity field moving in a particular direction. Now, when we apply that to an epiglottal stop, this is the laryngoscopic view. So if we look at this first, we see the stop closing and then opening, raising, full closure, and then going back down. Now, if we look at the vector fields in the ultrasound, we see them going up, 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 and then suddenly back down. In the compass, we see a sum of the vectors. So you can see that will move up and then back down as soon as the sound is complete. Up and then down. And we can convert that movement into millimeters so we can get a quantified measure of the raising of the larynx and then going back down. So this is the extrapolation. Top and then back down. Now, if we look at the epiglottal stop, you can see that the stop began here and there was full closure. At the same time, the larynx was still going up until the end of the stop when it went back down. In the voiceless trill, at the beginning of the trill, the larynx is still going up until the end of the consonant, and then it goes back down. With the voice trill, you can see that these sounds like creaky voice, they're often challenging for pitch extraction algorithms, for the pitch trace to recognize. So Scott Moysick developed a trace which is pretty faithful to the fundamental frequency. At the beginning of the trill, the larynx is still rising until the end of the consonant, and then it goes back down. So we can tell from cineradiography that pharyngeals are primarily a function of epilaryngeal tube constriction, and using the simultaneous laryngoscopy and laryngeal ultrasound technique, we can evaluate larynx height, and we know that larynx height is a factor in producing pharyngeals. In fact, when larynx height correlates with pitch, the target is a tonal feature, but when larynx height does not correlate with pitch, as it does in those Tibeto-Burman languages we looked at, then the target is a pharyngeal, as in the Semitic languages we looked at. Now, finally, we're going to look at magnetic resonance imaging to give us a brief view of how we can begin to assess the volumes, the cavities of the vocal tract, and how laryngeal quality interacts with vowel quality. So we've looked at 3 vowels, E, A, U, being produced in modal voice, first by me, and together with a glottal stop, and then together with an epiglottal stop. And then Scott Moysick produced E, A, U in modal voice, in creaky voice, and in raised larynx voice, which is basically laryngeal constriction. Now, this is the vowel E in modal voice, and we see the tongue position doesn't change much when we combine it with glottal stop. But of course, the larynx has closed partially, and the aryepiglottic folds have pulled the mechanism partially shut so that the epilaryngeal tube is smaller than it was when it was open for modal voice. And this is as much closure as we need for glottal stop. However, in epiglottal stop, the whole area of the tube has shortened from back to front upwards, and the tongue has retracted, and the larynx has raised. So all those three things we said at the beginning that were going to affect the mechanism are moving together in coordination. Laryngeal constriction, tongue retraction, and larynx raising. In creaky voice, we see the same narrowing at the glottis, but it doesn't change the position of the tongue in the oral vocal tract very much. However, in introducing raised larynx voice, the larynx is pulling the tongue backwards at the same time that the tongue is moving upwards and forwards, fronting for E. And the larynx is swiveling towards the front in order to compensate, to be able to make the sound, keep the tube open, but at the same time produce an E. So this generates what we might call double bunching of the tongue, backing or retracting and fronting at the same time. In the open vowel ah, there isn't much change in the shape of the tongue between modal voice and adding a glottal stop. Glottal stop simply adds the degree of constriction that we need at the larynx. However, in epiglottal stop, we're exceedingly constricted upwards and forwards as the tongue retracts. But there's still not much change in the height of the larynx, which tells us that different vowels will respond differently to different laryngeal configurations. Open vowels don't change much in larynx height, apparently, whereas the close vowel E did. Creaky voice didn't change much for the ah vowel in the position of the tongue, but when we add raised larynx voice or pharyngalized voice, there's much more narrowing and compaction at the back. Finally, for the raised vowel oo, which is open in modal voice, the tongue position doesn't change much when we add a glottal stop, but there is partial constriction enough to stop the vocal folds from vibrating. However, we get the double bunching when we add an epiglottal stop, pulling the mechanism upwards and forwards, causing retracting of the tongue and raising of the larynx, because oo is also a close vowel like E. So every vowel that we look at is going to have a different response all around the vowel chart to the different kinds of laryngeal effects that we can add. Creaky voice doesn't change the shape of the tongue very much, but it does dramatically change the way the tongue fills the cavity and the way the larynx changes the shape of the cavity at the back. So that laryngeal constriction, lingual retraction, and compaction of the larynx all go together to change the quality of the oo in the whole vocal tract. So what we've found is that retraction of the tongue that goes along with laryngeal constriction means that vowel quality will change depending on what's happening in the larynx. Creaky voice resembles glottal stop in laryngeal posture, and raised larynx voice or pharyngalization resembles epiglottal stop because they're both very narrow in their laryngeal configuration. Different vowels will be affected differently by different laryngeal postures. including larynx height. And we generally found that the vowels pattern in a more or less fronted, raised, and retracted pattern, more than high, low, front, back. So we've shown some instrumental techniques for analyzing how the larynx works together with the tongue in the oral tract to give us vowel quality, voice quality, and tonal quality, because pharyngeal series have been shown to interact with the tones of many languages that we've looked at. Here are some references that you can consult later to see where some of the language data has come from that we illustrated. Working, for example, with Jerry Edmondson and Zeki Hassan and Cécile Padayoudi, Lamazuo, and also some of the background of the theory that we've introduced, and some of the earlier and more recent work on voice quality and how the epilarynx works. And finally, some more theoretical information on how the vocal folds can be modeled to produce non-modal phonation, and how phonology interacts with the laryngeal articulator in a grounded way to do some things that hadn't been described in the same way before. Also some descriptions of ultrasound and other languages that we have just illustrated. So thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Professor John Esling, for your very interesting presentation. It was really inspiring for us. I think there's a lot of good questions here. So we have some questions that can I ask the question from the audience to you? Pass the questions to you. So so there's a question by Fabio Vaz. He is interested in, he likes to know about the E vowel, E. Okay, so it's the difficult vowel to sing in high pitch. So he's interested, what exactly happens with this vowel physiologically speaking?
Although I haven't looked at singing per se, like many of our colleagues, I can say, based on the evidence we've just looked at, that E is going to be the most distant vowel from the laryngeal articulator. That means that if you're producing different kinds of voice with your larynx to produce different song, different kinds of voices in singing, E is going to be the furthest one. And we saw that the effect of the laryngeal articulator was greatest for the E vowel. That means that the open vowel ah didn't change as much depending on the laryngeal configuration, because the E vowel is already constricted. We could say E is the pharyngeal vowel, at least the retracted vowel, whereas ah is the pharyngeal vowel or the retracted vowel, whereas E is the opposite to that. And U is also raised, so it's further away from the laryngeal articulator. So it may be that the laryngeal configuration that you're adopting for singing different voices will have a greater effect on E and U than on the open vowels. I hope this leads you in the right direction.
Yeah, I think so. And also there's an interesting thing about the E vowel, because Louis Golding has shown with his MRI data that it's a very constricted vowel. So it touches the palatal area much of the time during some productions. So it's kind of a constricted vowel. So that's another different thing that relates to only this vowel, maybe, I think.
And they have shown, they've done very good work at USC looking at different voice qualities with MRI. And it shows that the E is the double bunched vowel, as Catford described in many languages of the Caucasus. So without even looking, he was able to listen and surmise that the tongue was pulling into the larynx at the same time that it was reaching up to the front and the upper part of the vocal tract.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I have a question for you. So you cited in your book the work of Leonardo Fuchs with the so-called Mongolian, let's say, Mongolian throat singing. So in singing, we have lots of distorted sounds, for example, produced at the Aryepiglottic folds, ventricular folds, and even different distortion at the vocal folds, resulting in many different singing sounds that we call distorted voices. So does your model could contribute?
We have a very good description in the book of, and we cite many of the recordings and artists who have produced recordings material of throat singing. And we describe that there are a number of parameters that change when we engage different kinds of throat singing, just like different kinds of musical voices or registers. And some of them involve trilling of the aryepiglottic folds, and some of them involve primarily narrowing of the lower vocal tract cavities to give us these resonances like we heard in some of the tense phonological series in Tibeto-Burman languages. And these throat singing techniques come from Tuva, Mongolia, other parts of Asia, Northern Canada, Inuit throat singing. And all of these techniques are using a combination of configurations in the lower vocal tract that work together with configurations of the upper vocal tract. So it's the interplay between the two that give us very good, very interesting resonances. And we describe, or we point out in the book, that some of these recordings also have instructions on how to produce throat singing, which I would recommend that you follow because it's quite easy to do. At least some techniques are quite easy to
Yeah, I practice that myself. We have a singing course in Brazil that we are taught all this kind of this distorted voice. That's why I question. And we develop in São Paulo with Professor Sandra Madureira and Zuleika Camargo using the VPAS model, by Laver and colleagues, like a method for analyzing the singing voice. So that's why I think your model adds some extra knowledge that we don't have in the VPAS model. So thank you for that. So I have here a question by Midori Hanayama. She said that they have a laryngeal fricative as a compensatory articulation in the cleft palate patients because of the velopharyngeal incompetence. She studied that with Professor Kawano in the Kyoto University. So you have something to comment about that?
I would say that we have found in chapter 7 of our book, the material that contributed by Lise Crévier-Buchmann in Paris has indicated that there are many laryngeal compensatory mechanisms. The compensation of the larynx for a range of physical disorders of the vocal tract is very much like we find in natural language, in the languages of the world. That is, the way that speakers of different languages use the vocal tract normally is what some speakers who do not have laryngeals or pharyngeals in their phonological inventory, it's what they have to use to compensate for what they might have lost in the oral vocal tract or other parts of the vocal tract. So I should also point out that accompanying the book, the companion files are on a website which you can find through the Cambridge University Press website for the book. There is a tab that says resources, and then resources again, and then companion files. And you can freely download all of the data that we've used in our research in the book. And many of those files are clinical examples of how the speaker had to compensate. And we don't have as many examples of oral disorders as we do of laryngeal disorders. But the compensation in the larynx is quite easy to see. And it might be similar to what some of you have observed in clinical situations.
Okay, I have a question here by Joe Ferreira. He's interested in your description of the IPA vowel system. So his question is, I had to translate. I hope I had translated right. So you propose a modification of the traditional IPA vowel system based on the empirical files of the Laryngeal Articulator Model.
Potentially in the future, but this is simply a way of looking at the oral vocal tract, at the same time trying to integrate with what's happening in the laryngeal vocal tract, which is not explicit in the current vowel chart. So it's in the direction of joining the two parts of the vocal tract together in a more effective way. But it just represents any modification of any part of the IPA chart represents a path of research. It represents theoretical developments that are the product of research, which leads towards a different interpretation that can be modeled in a different way, and then modeled symbolically on the chart. So it's good to use different versions of the chart that we come up with. And I should mention also that the chart of the IPA in the IPA phonetics app is also different from the official IPA chart. But it gives you the laryngoscopic and the ultrasound images at the same time as pharyngeal and epiglottal sounds on the chart are produced. So we had to elaborate the chart in order to accommodate all of the articulations that you can make in the larynx. So that's simply a path of research which may lead to a modification of the chart at some time in the future.
Nice. And that's another thing that I forgot to mention in the beginning of your presentation. So Professor John Wesley has created an app for iPad, iPhone, I think, that have all of the IPA symbols in the app, so you can hear to the sound and play. I think you can download the sound, so it's a very interesting app as well.
Yes, the app is called IPA Phonetics.
Yeah, IPA Phonetics, but it's only for the Mac Store.
Apple. It's only
right?
Apple. Yes.
Apple phone. Yeah. All right. Nice. Okay. So, Beatriz Raposo de Medeiros asked here, I would like to know if there are other concepts like the gesture overlapping to better understand things that happen those two I cannot produce this two different sound. She said she cannot remember the language. I remember that not only pharyngeal articulation would change, but also voice quality.
Right. Was that West African languages where the vowel quality changes as well as the voice quality?
Yeah, I think it sounds the first one sounded like two, and the other one like oh. The other it changed. Yeah.
Tu. Yeah. In Kabyle, it's tu and to.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. That's.
The vowel doesn't have to change. That's up to the language. The language decides, and also speakers decide. So different speakers will produce the target phoneme or the target word. I mean, they're aiming at saying a word. So they will produce the target word in different ways. Not every speaker will be able to control the mechanism in exactly the same way. So speakers, of course, vary in their production. So sometimes a language will change vowel quality more than another language when the voice quality is different. So we saw that in Nosuyi, Tibeto-Burman language from Sichuan, the change in vowel quality was very slight. We had more trilling at the lips than we did change in vowel quality. But in a West African language, it's possible that the vowel quality could change substantially when the laryngeal quality changes. It doesn't have to, but there are many options in the laryngeal articulator that the language can choose to combine with oral articulations.
All right. Yeah, I was curious about in this example. So you said in the first syllable there was no trilling, lip trilling. Right. In the other there was a lip trilling. Why you didn't note in the phonetic transcription the trilling? I couldn't see.
Oh, we do that in our illustrations that are published in JIPA.
Ah.
You can find an illustration in the Journal of the IPA. These are listed, it's listed in the references. And those are also accompanied by companion files on the IPA website and also the CUP website, which illustrate, and the illustration in the journal marks all of these features narrowly, phonetically. We
nice.
Also have an illustration that just appeared of Jianchuan Bai, and the Bai language is a very good example of how vowels and tone and laryngeal voice quality interact in the phonology.
Yeah, I think to complement the further question by Beatriz Raposo de Medeiros, I think she's passionate about, I don't know if you know the phonology model by Goldstein and others. And how would you describe you showed to us that there are some gestures, there's some overlapping gestures in your model, like the lip trilling. We cannot hear what's going on in the larynx because of the lip trilling. How would you treat, or let's say, the overlapping gestures in your model?
I'm not sure I can answer that as well as Scott Moisick might. He produced a model with Eva Tchaikovsky-Higgins called the Phonological Potentials Model, which also appears in the book and also in an article in JIPA last year. That model, I think, is very compatible with these other models. I think it complements them very well. And it indicates what articulations in different parts of the vocal tract might be synergistic with other actions in other parts of the vocal tract. So it links the vocal tract together in a kind of a network. So I'd say it's much more of a network than overlapping. but I can't say yet how it might integrate with other phonological models.
Other theories.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I think we are done with the questions. So I would like to thank you once more for this amazing talk. And I don't know if Miguel have said that to you, but we have here in Brazil this Abralim journal. So we are gathering the text of these talks and presentations for the Abralim online. And you are invited to submit a paper to the journal. We'll be very honored with your presence in our journal, in the Abralim journal.
Thank you very much. It's very nice of you. Thank you. And thank you again for the invitation. That's very kind.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'll see you next time.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.